Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering. On this episode, I spoke with Cedric Chin. You may know Cedric from his incredible newsletter, Commoncog. In my opinion, the magic in doing data really well always lives at the intersection between disciplines. DBT focuses a lot at the intersection between the data analyst and the data engineer. And this intersection is what we came to call analytics engineering. But Cedric lives at a different intersection, the intersection between the data analyst and the operator, which is exactly the intersection I'm most interested in these days. Often I find that people in the data ecosystem too easily dismiss the perspectives of non-data people. They need to become data literate. We need to guide them to help them shape their questions. The information in this way of thinking flows one way. But what you'll take from this conversation is that it may be the data practitioners who need to do the learning. Cedric has deeply studied the Amazon Weekly Business Review, one of the most well-known and successful data-driven cadences in the business world. He's dissected it. He's applied it to his own business. He's built tools to help others apply it in their businesses. Cedric's perspective is that data should not primarily be used to facilitate exploratory data analysis, to answer a series of stakeholder questions. Instead, it should be used to establish statistical process control, to rigorously and continuously understand and then modify the behavior of a complex process. This was one of my favorite conversations I've ever had on the podcast, and I would have loved to take it for another few hours. I learned a ton, and I think you will too. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Cedric, welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. I listened to, I think, 10 episodes of the Analytics Engineering Podcast to prepare, literally, in the last week alone.
Oh my gosh, that's too many. I every once in a while do that with a podcast, and you start to have somebody's voice in your head. So I'm sorry. You have a very interesting background, and if I looked at your LinkedIn page and then I read all of the issues of your newsletter, I would not totally understand how the one led to the other. Can you talk a little bit about your career and where your perspective has been shaped from?
Oh gosh, I'm gonna really stand out like a sore thumb amongst all your guests. I am not a data professional. I am here from the business side of things, and I'm here to tell data professionals that they're business people asking them questions. The business people are stupid. So I studied computer science, and then I knew I wanted to start a company, and I joined a company in Vietnam. Well, it's a company in Singapore, but I ran the engineering office in Vietnam. And the deal...
And you're based in Singapore now?
Based in Singapore now. Back when I was running the office in Vietnam, I was flying back and forth, right? And we were bootstrapping this company. It was a point of sales company, primarily small, medium enterprises, customer base mostly out of Singapore. And I helped my boss bootstrap the company from basically nothing to 4.5 million in annual revenue. And now it's a lot more than that. Completely bootstrapped. He owns all the equity. He's hit his number. He's kind of retired. And at the very end, he was like, Cedric, it's an amazing journey. Do you want to continue with the company? And I was like, no, I want what you have. Right? Yeah, we had this amazing fun time learning business, growing the business together. I want to go and start something on my own. He was like, yeah, of course. What can he say to that, right? He understands where I'm coming from. So when I joined the company, I cut a deal with him, 5% of the company, but he could buy it back at a capped price. So it was not venture capital. So I had to basically negotiate, basically from first principles, figure it out. So he bought the equity back because I knew he cared about control. And with that nest egg, I went off and I started trying to start a company. And the first thing that I did was I looked at my skills. I knew software engineering. I knew how to run operations in a uncomfortable third world country, but I didn't know how to do marketing, and I knew I was bad at sales. And so I started a blog to learn content marketing, as one does.
Give me a rough time frame. When was that?
This was 2018. So
okay.
I left the company in 2017. It was 4.5 million from nothing. That's pretty cool. didn't, what do you call it? There's an incubator thing called Entrepreneur First. Didn't like it. Didn't want to be a dice roll in somebody else's portfolio, I guess. I was, bootstrap all the way. So it was quite an alien experience. And then started the blog for content marketing reasons. Initially, it was about thinking about careers. And so I was marketing to people early in their careers. But eventually it became about like trying to make sense of the business experiences that I had, because I was negotiating against and dealing with counterparties who were very sophisticated in business. And I think many cultures around the world have people like that. They never really went to school. They didn't have an MBA, but they're just so goddamn good at business. And I was like, how did they become good at business? Right. And about, I think a year in, I started to test my content marketing skills. I went and worked for this data company, business intelligence company. I was doing it part-time, was doing their content marketing part-time for them. And during that process, so the sort of short bit of that story was, at the end of it, I repositioned their company and then doubled their annual recurring revenue in about 8 months with no additional marketing spend.
And this is like you as a part-time content marketer? Like that's not generally the job description of that's pretty cool.
I know, but so it's like I was not happy. Not happy with not making an impact, basically. And I was very used to making an impact in the previous company, right? Like basically help my boss grow to 7 figures. But during that process, as you well know, because I know that you have a marketing background as well, or at least you understand marketing, you empathize with your user base. And so I began to empathize with data people. And I was really puzzled. Like, why why do you have all these horrible stories of like, they answer questions and then like nothing happens and then they burn out and then they either go into product management or they become data engineers where it's a clearer value path to get promoted, right? And you hear these stories again and again and again. And secondly, as a business person who wants to get better at business, right? How do you become data driven? How do you use data in a company? So about, I think, a year after I stopped working with the BI company, a couple of months after I was working with the BI company, Colin Breyer, who was Jeff Bezos' second shadow, and he had already left Amazon. And at the time, he had just published a book called Working Backwards, which was with Bill Carr. So Colin Breyer and Bill Carr, and the book was basically a set of collection of mechanisms that allowed Amazon to be Amazon. And chapter 6 of that book was how Amazon uses data, right? And he basically said to me, I've read your book summary because I love the book. I know you're technical. I know you have a computer science background. We are trying to teach large companies to do the WBR, the weekly business review, and to use metrics the Amazon way. And it turns out that what we wrote in the book's not enough. Would you be willing to come and help us test the software that we've written, that we're writing, some open source stuff that, well, I don't know if it's open source yet, but he will eventually open source it. And more importantly, to explicate, to turn all this knowledge in their heads into documentation and tutorials and stuff that can give these executive teams to implement the WBR. And of course I say, yes, please tell me how to be data driven, because like how, right? I've talked to so many data people, the sort of like the joke that I used to have with marketing folks, right, was if you can sit down with a data person and get them to complain about their job within 5 minutes, then you understand your target persona. And I wanted to know what was the answer. Anyway, so that probably brings us to where we are.
Well, I mean, it kind of does. But so you have this newsletter that.
Oh yes.
I mean, how many issues have you done now?
I don't know. It's I've stopped counting.
Dozens, hundreds.
Hundreds, definitely hundreds. It's been since
okay.
2018, right? So the audience is primarily operators, so business executives, some people who sit on boards.
So you're not primarily writing to quote unquote data practitioners.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
And they just picked up on it. I think for whatever reason, like lots. I'm connected to a lot of data people now on LinkedIn because they apparently like the stuff and they read it and they share. But it's really basic. Like, how do you use data in business? And I don't care about the tools. I just want to talk about the problem is not the tools, is basically my thing, right? The problem is in the heads of the business people. And the data people are sophisticated, right? It's just the business people aren't using data well. Most of the people that I'm writing for are investors, executives, right? And they also have sort of similar questions, I think. And it's sort of easier for me to write from that position because these people often have power. And so therefore they can make changes in the organization, and then the data people will benefit when the organization knows how to use data well, right? Which is a lot easier than if you're a data person with no political power, trying to change the way the business uses data.
It's such an interesting topic. This is the part of the conversation where we have to figure out how to collectively unpick this like massive topic. Let me maybe see if this is a good way to get started. The thing that made me want to reach out to you and have this conversation is that I published a thing back in I think it was August. Maybe our conversation happened in like a previous version. Maybe it was like back in July, but whatever. And I think it was a precursor to the full analytics development lifecycle ADLC post that I put out. And in it, I talk about how the role of data analysts is to do insight generation, is to essentially like have good access to clean data that you can then kind of go exploring through, spelunking through, and search for the insights that the business needs to make decisions on. And I made the statement that analytics isn't fundamentally a factory or something like that. I can't remember.
Assembly line.
Yeah. And I think you picked up on this, and oftentimes it's a successful post when you generate a lot of conversation. And there was a lot of conversation generated on exactly this topic, and it was around really like, how should we perceive the value that is created by data analysts, maybe by data practitioners more generally, or maybe just by like data? How does doing all of this stuff that we do all the time, like actually, how should we think about the value that it generates? And I think I was representing what is probably almost like conventional wisdom. And I didn't even say it giving it that much thought. I wasn't like, oh, let me like rigorously think about this perspective. I think it was more just like, yeah, this is kind of how we broadly conceive of it. But when I read your pushback on this topic, which is like, and other people as well, like Taylor from, I don't remember where Taylor Murphy is.
Taylor Murphy from Arch.
Yeah. He picked it up as well and say like, well, what if we do conceptualize data more as an assembly line? And I'm not unreceptive to that at the outset, but then I read a lot of your stuff. I was like, okay, there's really something here. And it's a part of the data process that I think I personally have a little bit less experience with and have not existed in the context where I've needed to do this version of data. Anyway, this is all just a tee up to say that like, maybe why don't you try to frame what you see as the value that data can provide to organizations when it is like living up to its fullest potential?
Maybe I should start with the conventional view of data in the data world, because I think that's something that everybody's familiar with, right? We throw around, well, not we, I shouldn't say we, I'm not a data person, but data professionals I talk to throw around terms like you answer questions, you generate insights, the business person asks you a question and then you give them some answer after sometimes very hard work of like doing the instrumentation, like figuring out what you have, data you have, and then like figuring out correlations, relationships, or whatever. And then the business person, and this is a common experience that I've heard from every data professional, the business person goes, okay, cool. And then does nothing with it, right? Not always. Sometimes it really does lead to impactful stuff. But a lot of the times it turns out that the business person sort of carelessly asks you as a data person or the data team, right, a question that actually doesn't matter to the business. They're just curious. And they don't know that you as the data professional have to go through hell and high water to get the answer to that question, right? And a data professional told me after reading like the whole bunch of stuff that I covered, after I'd gone through not just like what Amazon did, but also like other companies like Amazon who use these ideas, right? And how they actually use data, and how in some cases they, like in Coke Industries, for example, which is one of the companies that I talk about I reference in the series, eventually become so evil that they like take over Senate races in the Republican Party because they're very good at using data. but
not touching that with a 10-foot pole.
It's a very different context of using data, right? And this data professional, when he was reading, I was like, it's almost as if the problem with most businesses and most business people is that there's too many questions they can be asking. And there's no way to sort of narrow down the set of questions that really matter in the business, right? And because you can't differentiate between like what's a good question, what's a bad question, right? The data team is like this service desk that is overwhelmed with questions. And sometimes the CEO like, unthinkingly goes, oh, I wonder what the answer to this is. And then like, people struggle. So it turns out that in really good data-driven companies of the type that I dug into, the term that I'm using is process control, from statistical process control, which is the set of ideas that was used to ramp up production for World War II and then was used to transform industrial Japan post World War II, and led to the creation of the Toyota production system. It's this particular style of using data called statistical process control. And the basic idea is just, how does your business work? Your business is a system. It's a process. It has some inputs, it has some outputs. And you can figure out what those inputs and outputs are, right? Amazon has a much simpler to understand framework, which is controllable input metrics and output metrics. So obviously the ultimate output metrics you care about in the firm, in the company, is things like financials, profit, revenue, free cash flow, right? But there's some complex set of inputs and intermediate inputs as well that lead out the other end. And there's some lag from the inputs to the outputs. And your executives running the company, running this complex machine, need to have an idea of how the inputs flow through to the outputs. Now, given that frame, how do you actually piece together the causal model of your business? And the core thing you have to grapple with is that it's not that easy to sort of say, okay, we've driven these inputs and then we get some outputs out the other end. The problem that we have to deal with as business people is variation. Most people can't deal with variation. Variation just means that something wiggles. And we know that when we step on a weighing scale, that our weight wiggles, right? It doesn't just stay the same. But it's even worse in business. Metrics can wiggle, sales metrics can wiggle like, upwards of 40, 50%. And that's perfectly normal. Nothing else has happened. And so if you have a way of differentiating between a real wiggle that you have to worry about and you should investigate, and routine variation, which is just a normal wiggle you can sort of ignore, you have a way of separating signal from noise. And you have a way of finding out things that actually move the needle on the metrics that you care about, or the outcomes that you care about, right? And now what this does, if you're able to sort of differentiate between like routine variation, exceptional variation, is that you unlock the most common of human learning loops, which is trial and error. And that context, that data usage context, results in a way of using data and asking questions of a data team that is very different from a company that doesn't have this sort of like a weekly process of figuring out how the business actually works. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, this frame is we're tackling a very big topic and we're like sort of biting away at the elephant here. But maybe that's a good way to start.
I've never heard that saying before. Biting away at the apple, I'm there with you, but
No,
I'm just
biting away at the
imagining we're
elephant.
taking bites on an elephant. Yeah, I'm with you. And it's a compelling model of the world. And I know that in what I think is your kind of canonical post on this topic, you kind of trace it all the way back to Edward Deming. And is he the cheaper by the dozen guy? I forget. Maybe there was a different guy that like implemented the scientific management. But
oh, I see. That's his name. Yeah, no, not really. Related. Toyota did draw from both though. It was the guy who did those counting thing, right?
Yeah.
Counting, yeah. Productivity.
All the stopwatches. I follow along with the fundamental insight here, which is to say that what we should be doing is building a causal model for our organization. And that requires defining key metrics and understanding the relationships between the metrics, and then having a reasonable statistical view of what's noise and what's actual variation, and then making decisions based on that. But obviously the devil is in the details, and it would be interesting to kind of poke at the model of the world a little bit and see whether we know how Amazon does it, and if there's other contexts in which this model kind of is less applicable, or et cetera. Okay, take the early growth of DBT. We have very little insight into what drives the adoption of DBT core. And especially in the early days, we essentially had a meetup group that had a few meetups. Every once in a while, we had a Slack group that every once in a while new people joined. And then we get to observe the anonymized usage behavior of DBT core. And we could draw lines that went exponentially up and to the right and at a very consistent pace. But that metric wasn't controllable for us because it just kind of happened outside of our ability to. And even if we had more meetups or we tried to do different things, it was just like a law of nature. It just did its own thing. And we were unable to observe the causal loop there and then drive that. And so we just kind of watched it over time. To me, there are so many examples of this type of, especially in the world of marketing.
Oh, yes.
There's the thing that Facebook famously just does not give you a lot of data, that you just have to kind of trust that they're telling you the truth. I don't know. Anyway, does this model of the world always work? Or did Amazon happen to have a perfect business model where they could just observe the inputs and outputs and draw causal relationships really effectively?
So yes, it works, but there are certain things that are harder to measure using this methodology um, than others. So marketing attribution is not solved by this method. Like it's marketing attribution, it's really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at early Amazon, they defaulted to things that they could actually tell there's an impact, even if the impact is vague.
Oh, that's so interesting.
They didn't do TV ads. They did it for a while and they realized that, we can't really find controllable inputs and controllable outputs. We can do controllable inputs on the cost, the amount of money we spend on TV ads, but we can't tell the output, right? So let's stop. So what did they do? They defaulted to affiliate marketing. So they had paid Excite, Yahoo, a certain amount of money. This is all public information. And when the budget ran out, right? For people who came in and made a purchase. So this was affiliate marketing in the 1990s. You can imagine how bad that was. And they could sort of model that behavior. The other thing that they could do was they could model word of mouth growth. They could say that within a certain number of months, a certain percentage of people who turn out to be new users in this new purchases in this first month, right? They didn't have the term cohort, they called it like vintages. So like by the fourth vintage will be like certain percentage that will become a steady state number of customers, right? And that was something that so it doesn't work for everything. For TV ads, it's very hard to measure, right? And there's no way that there's no magic bullet for this, right? But for a lot of things, it is possible to figure out. So I'll tell you a story. One of the nice things about running Commoncog is that it's a dinky little business and it doesn't really matter if I tell you about how my business works and I can tell you my metrics. It's wonderful. So maybe we can't talk about DBT, but we can talk about, we can talk about early DBT.
Do you have employees right now? Is it?
Yeah, 7 people.
Okay, cool.
A lot of them part-timers, but
also bootstrapped.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're doing the thing. That's cool.
We wanted to figure out like, how does the newsletter grow, right? DBT has a newsletter as well. And if you could figure out the controllable levers, the controllable inputs to the newsletter growth, that would be nice. So, the first step is just measure. Just measure. And then every week, just take a look in we do a WBR, a full Amazon WBR, right? It's almost overpowered. And you go take a look and figure out what routine variation looks like. So you develop a fingertip feel of what normal looks like. And in the case of DBT, I would say, well, what I would do is I would take a look at the rate of growth, right? And I'll put that on an XMR chart, right? A week-on-week rate of growth, right? And then I would try to see if XMR, we're using terms that our listeners don't know. Sorry. An XMR chart is a magical tool that allows you to tell routine versus exceptional variation. We can talk about that later, but it doesn't really matter. Just think of it as a magical tool that it's not perfect, but it gets you a lot of the way there without a lot of statistical sophistication. And I would then look for exceptional variation and investigate that if I was in early DBT, right? And then see if we can find some controllable lever and maybe go interview some of the people when there's exceptional variation. Anyway. So we applied it to Commoncog, and what's some of the controllable inputs that you can think about? Well, LinkedIn posts or Twitter posts, right? And it turns out that there's a linear relationship between visits to the site when I post on Twitter, and if I ramp up my Twitter posting, there's a linear relationship, an increase in visits from Twitter, but there's no change in newsletter signups. Similarly for LinkedIn. Right? Maybe some of them do sign up, but it's not exceptional variation. It's not special variation, right? One day, October last year, we saw exceptional variation in in-depth readers, which is people who have read more than one page, and uniques, newsletter signups. Like, holy shit, what happened? And it turned out that a 20,000 Substack, an investing Substack, had linked to Commoncog. Now that's interesting. And it turned out, by the way, that the author of the Substack had tweeted just 1 week before, and no exceptional variation on any of our metrics. And this person had 70,000 followers on Twitter, but zero budge to our metrics. So that's interesting. So what's the obvious thing, right? The obvious thing is like, okay, we need to go run an experiment. What if, in terms of the bang for buck for our attempt, like to work, right? Bang for buck for our effort. It makes more sense, instead of posting on social media or hiring someone to post on social media regularly, right, to go and hunt down Substacks and try to get them to link to us. It could be by buying ads, and we have to experiment with that, or we could be trying to make friends with them so that they link to us naturally, right? there are a range of experiments that we could do because we now know that this is a lever that will result in a change in the output metric that we care about. So yeah, okay, maybe I'll stop there and let you like ask questions or whatever. I've got more examples, lots more examples.
So what is the hypothesis that you're working with from that? Is that newsletters perform better than Twitter, or that this in particular, like newsletters with a population of 20,000 readers do better than Twitter? Like what should one take from that?
Excellent. Yes, exactly. So this was another thing that when like the devil is in the details, right? Just because you have a signal doesn't necessarily mean that you know how, you know why it works. So you have to come up with a theory and you have to come up with an experiment and then you have to run it, right? And what we actually did was, so there are a number of variables here. It could be that one theory could be that people who read a newsletter, especially an investing newsletter, would be interested in Commoncog, which is a business sort of investing adjacent publication, and we should target those. And so then you can run an experiment. So we ran newsletter ads in investing newsletters versus data newsletters. I don't know why we chose data newsletters. Maybe because there were a lot of people like signing up there were data people at the time because of the blog posts about data. And it turned out that so we just finished the experiment. It took some time. That investing the data newsletter, we had one conversion, as in like purchase, but the goal wasn't really conversion for this particular experiment. The goal was newsletter signups. We didn't really get good results from the investing substacks that we targeted. But one thing that we did realize was below a cutoff point of 6,000 subscribers, it actually didn't. There's no results worth talking about. So we're doing another iteration. And now the sort of thing is we're focusing on investing substacks and we're narrowing down the range of variables that we're trying to target. But the point is, a data person working on this project with me, right? And I do have a data person working with me on this project, right? Feels empowered. They know that the questions I'm asking is not dumb. They know why we're digging into this in the first place because they prepare the WBR and they have the full context of the business. They see everything from like traffic all the way to financials, and we apply variation analysis to financials as well, right? And one thing that we've sort of figured out, maybe in the investing substack, we're still running experiments, so we don't really know. But the data person isn't sort of asking, is this useless or is this useful? They know that it's useful, right? And the second thing is that the assembly line process in this particular case isn't a problem because the bottleneck is the experiment. The bottleneck is action in the business that uncovers causal mechanisms that allow us to pull. And so this one is still ongoing. But it's like a neat example that I think a lot of people will understand because a lot of B2B companies have newsletters or like some kind of content marketing.
I could keep going down this thread for a really long time. Rather than trying to dig more into the kind of model of the world that you're describing, I think maybe the thing that is awkward to me about all of this is it feels very obvious. Nothing you're saying is like should be hard. And it's certainly not technically hard. I mean, like
all the data tools are good enough.
Good enough. And for some reason, BI tools don't generally draw XMR charts. Which, right? Like, how do you generate XMR charts? You have a tool that does that, right?
Yeah, we have an open source tool that we made open source because BI tools don't generate XMR charts, and we want people to steal it. We want BI tool vendors to steal the tool.
Oh, that's so funny. You actually want to drive change in the industry so that people can do this inside of BI tools.
Well, and actually, right now, the funny thing is that the most people who are using the tool are business people. They are business people who want to get results, and they don't have data teams, so they like can't bother to like deal with the data team and wait for them. So like, just give me the CSV and I'll paste it into this tool so that I can run the experiments, which is sad.
Wait, so what do people pay you for?
Commoncog. Commoncog is for people who want to get good at business because I want to get good business. So I bring them along for the journey.
It's a subscription model, like a newsletter subscription model. Okay.
It is. Yes. The data people. Now, the open source thing is more like I feel for data people, or like I have an affinity for, and I empathize with them because Plus, my wife is a data analyst, so I feel her pain, and it's just. I'll give you an answer to the question you didn't articulate. Why is this not more widespread?
Yeah, so
I've asked the question.
I think that what I was poking at originally was like maybe it's not relevant in all cases, and maybe it is to a greater or lesser degree relevant in different cases. But I think that you would probably take the belief that like it's generally a useful tool in most contexts, and so then there has to be some like reason that we're not. And my guess is that it somehow has to do with organizational dynamics. Is that probably right?
Yes, it has to do with power. It has to do with discipline, and it has to do with will, not skill. You have to bear in mind that Amazon did all of this in 1997 with Excel 1997, which sucks, right? And they could forecast within 3% error rate their growth of their business at the time. And Colin liked to say to me when I was working with him, like, look, dude, like Amazon got to $1 billion on Excel. So if we got it into to $1 billion running the WBR on Excel, what excuse do you have? Like, you have the modern data stack. You have everything that we didn't have, right, back in the day. And literally, the way it worked was that every Sunday night in a shared folder, a peon all the departments would drop Excel files into like this shared folder, and then a peon, which turned out to be Eugene Wei, would.
Oh, that's who I was trying to think of. He's written extensively about this too, right?
Yes, he has.
Yes,
he was there at the beginning. In fact, many of the things that he put into practice, because he had to print the bloody thing, it was paper, and they would review the metrics on paper. It still persists in the WBR today. Like all the charts have numbers because of Eugene Wei. A lot of the charts have like no legend and numbers on the lines, because Eugene Wei was like, Amazon sent him to a Tufte lecture, and he was like, "Oh, this is obviously the right way to present data."
That's funny, huh?
Yeah, it's hilarious.
It always comes back to Tufte.
So, if the tools are not the problem, what's the problem? The problem is the social technical dynamics, right? The social bit of the social technical dynamics. The WBR is not just a metrics review meeting; it's also a political tool. Every Wednesday, every person who is a metrics owner, so like you're head of a department, you have you might not own metrics directly, sometimes you do, but you manage people who are metrics owners. Now, if somebody who is an executive asks one of your metrics owners under you in your department a question that you cannot answer, or you don't know the answer to, but whereas the metric owner knows the answer, you'll be shamed in front of the entire organization. So what happens in that kind of political context, right? That kind of, you really care about data, and you don't ask stupid questions of your data analysts, because what matters in this kind of a dynamic is you have a set of output metrics you have to hit by the end of the quarter. You have to figure out what the input metrics are. And the rule is we don't talk about the output metrics. We only talk about the controllable input metrics. So you need to go figure out what those controllable input metrics are. So now a fire is lit under your ass to work with your data team, and the data team is embedded inside your organization to figure out what those controllable input metrics are. And the way you figure it out is that you do trial and error quickly, right? You drive this and see if it pushes the output metric after some lag. No, doesn't work. Let's try another one, right? And you have to instrument, and it's okay. They give you if you say that we're still instrumenting, they say, okay, it's fine. Like, you can't push the controllable input metric. We'll give you some time to instrument. Everybody understands that in the org, right? But once you do, you better figure out what the controllable input metrics are. And then you start setting targets for, like, okay, we know that there's a causal relationship between pushing this and the output metrics we care about, which in many cases is absolute dollar free cash flow. Okay, let's go start pushing. The controllable input metrics, set goals for that. And then it becomes a very tight process where there's a fire under your ass, because every Wednesday morning you have to present to executives.
It's a system that, once it's working, I can see it being incredibly effective and self-perpetuating. It is also a system that I can really imagine being hard to create in the first place. Because most executives at a company do not actually want to subject themselves to that type of scrutiny in front of all of their peers.
Absolutely.
So you've got, at the beginning of all this, you've got the Bezos magic trick of probably yelling at everyone until they kind of got in line, which is not, I have no knowledge of that actually being how it happened, but I have to imagine.
Yes, it did. Him and Wilkie, he learned this from Jeff Wilkie, who was the manufacturing maestro, who came in and transformed all the fulfillment centers into basically factories.
When did Jeff Wilkie start? Was he there from the beginning?
No. He was recruited from another company, and he was already famous as a Six Sigma practitioner, right? So these ideas from Deming, they were titrated through Six Sigma. They entered Amazon, and then Amazon started applying it to everything, right? And then it was like, oh, it worked, because of course it did, right? Like, Toyota created the Toyota production system based on these ideas. They did trial and error with rigor, because with an XMR chart, you can actually tell that you've actually changed something. You don't have to rely on vibes or feeling. And you don't have to rely on A/B tests. People can't do A/B tests. Most people are not statistically sophisticated enough to do A/B tests. You just do trial and error, right? No, where were we going with this? Yes, if your readers want an example of what this looks like, where a company is very political and they're not good at data, and then they're transformed to use this, there is a book called American Icon, where Alan Mulally basically comes in, and he transforms Ford. He comes from Boeing. He goes into Ford, and he uses he calls it a business plan review every week, every Wednesday, incidentally. And he uses this as a tool to get the company in shape. He subjects the entire company into process control, and he uses this to weed out the incompetent executives who are political, because they can't hide when you're subject to this kind of process control. And then he uses it to forge cross-department assistance. Because one beautiful thing when you have a business review that measures the company end to end is that when there's a problem in one part of the company, you can say, hey, you in a different department, can you help this guy out? We're part of a team. Let's work together. Right? Because things that change in one department, especially if you figure out controllable input metrics, output metrics, they tend to, like, one person's output metric is sometimes another person's input metric. And so everybody has a bird's eye view of a very complex business, right? Mulali's thing takes a bit longer. Amazon's WBR is designed so that you can do 500 metrics in exactly 60 minutes. You don't go over time except during the holiday season. But the point is just the practice that matters, right? There was a trend, I think, over the last 12 months or so in the data community, at least the data people that I'm connected to on LinkedIn, talking about metrics trees. That's just as good. It doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
The point is that you need some kind of practice like this. And unfortunately, it requires shoving down by the CEO. At least all the successful examples I've seen has been somebody in a position of power on the executive team enforcing this. And when it works, it is a wonderful environment to work in as a data person, because everybody is motivated on the same business problems. Everybody has the same causal model of the business. And the data team is not some IT help desk to be ignored, right? They are critical to achieving your goals.
You're kind of come full circle to the comments that you made earlier, that you're not really a data person, and that your primary audience is operators. And I think that maybe one of the reasons why data people don't talk about this more on LinkedIn or wherever is that it's not something that's controllable for them. Either this is the context that they operate in or not, but it is, for a company to change the way that it does this, it requires the type of executive sponsorship that then gets books written about it.
Yeah.
So it's maybe not where people want to spend. And probably many data people have never worked in a context like this. It probably was more common in an era where there were like more physical, like manufacturing type processes that we were trying to measure. So probably the like experience set of people operating in this environment is just like actually not that high. Would you agree with that?
Somebody in my Commoncog community sort of observed that this kind of operational excellence only emerges when you have a very low return on invested capital. Not very low, single digit.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Because if you think about it, right, like if your margins are super, super high, your return on invested capital is super high, because like Google, you can be sloppy. Doesn't really matter, right? Who cares, right? You have a network effect. You're just generating gushes of cash. Doesn't matter. If you're like, your return on invested capital is negative, then it doesn't matter. Your operational excellence is just staving off the inevitable. You're just going to die. You're in a textile mill in America, and like you're fighting against But if you have a 3%, like say, return on invested capital, right? And operational excellence can double that for effectively free, which is, by the way, the percentage that both GE and also that Danaher, which is one of the stellar lean manufacturing companies, they have found that it's basically a free gift of 3%.
That's right. It is actually 3%.
It is actually 3%. And that's how they know when they acquire a new company, right? Like when we implement this data-driven processes and this lean manufacturing, we know that by year number or like month number X, your improvement should be this percent, because we have benchmarks. We've done so many of it. We know how it should be. So these kinds of methods tend to spread in organizations or industries where you have like a single-digit return on invested capital, because if you don't have it, then you die. It just so happens that Amazon is a low single-digit margin, I don't know, a low-margin business that just happened to hire somebody from manufacturing to deal with the scale of volume in their fulfillment centers. And then the ideas spread out, and they use it to crush their competitors, because the competitors just did not understand what was going on in their businesses. I often tell people that maybe you can get away with this in high margin businesses, right? But if you are in a low margin business and you're up against Amazon, and Amazon has process control, and you have something naive like the North Star metric framework, you're going to get crushed because you are just working towards one metric, right? Amazon is working towards like 16. And they can spin off things to like, oh, let's just undercut you in this particular way, and we'll process control that and process control the cost that we're spending to undercut you, and we can do pincer movements, right? So it's an organizational capability that is super powerful because it's born, I think, out of this crazy. You can sort of imagine like a dune planet of businesses with low ROIC.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I did not expect that answer, but the minute that you started down that train of thought, I was like, oh, yeah, that's a great insight. In that framing, one of the most interesting things that Amazon has probably done is combining the rigorous culture of manufacturing and low margin businesses with the innovative culture of tech. Because, like you're saying, those two cultures kind of drag you in different directions. There are a lot of, I'm going to use the term creative, but maybe that's not perfect, but there are a lot of creative people that probably exist more on the innovation side of the world. And if you try to subject them to statistical process control, they will probably perceive that as the death of innovation and move elsewhere. But Amazon has, I think, and I mean, maybe you could have different perspectives on this, but I think continued to be an innovative company for a long time, despite having this at the root of their culture.
Well, I know what Colin would say to this because I asked him this a lot, of course, because I'm from tech, right? I didn't have an operations research background the way that he did. And he was obviously a very rigorous operator, and he had sat through so many product launches. He sat through the creation of the Kindle, he sat through the creation of Prime, he sat through the creation of AWS. So I asked him, like, isn't this an intention with like inventing new things, which is the whole point of like Jeff Bezos has a book called Invent and Wonder, right? And he said, no, you have to understand that if you're swimming in the data of your customers, and one of the big ideas in SBC, by the way, is that a metric is not the thing, right? A metric is just a shadow of a process. The process is the thing. It's throwing off a stream of numbers, but there's something out there that's concrete that you actually care about. The numbers are just like a signal.
The metric is the best you can do to quantify that process.
Yes, but what that thing is in many, many cases is what the customer experiences, right? In Amazon, right? So if you have a fingertip feel on the pulse of the business and what the customer experiences every week, you have no choice but to think like the customer, and you have no choice but to come up with ideas because you understand the customer's pains. And so when people sort of ask, like, how is Amazon so innovative, right? They'll say, well, we swim in the data every week. We know what our customers experience every week. We know what pains they have. And in trying to find out how to solve their pains, because the answer might not always be a controllable input metric. The answer might be a fundamental reimagining of the process or an invention of a new device like the Kindle that can change the customer experience. So that's one answer. And then the second answer was like, I naturally asked, what happens when you're launching a new thing? Do you subject stuff to process control? It's like you subject some things to process control. So for example, if you're launching Amazon Prime Video, right, you have to launch with instrumentation for latency and, quality metrics, like what's the customer experience, right? Because if you launch and these metrics suck, then you are able to walk away and say that, it's not the idea that is bad. The thing that's bad here is that we didn't give the customer a good experience. So we have to try again, right? So you need to be able to differentiate between the customer experience, the idea being bad versus like the customer experience being bad because your launch sucked. And the metrics should guard against that, but not, of course, like the actual qualitative evaluation of whether the idea was a good one or not. That's qualitative.
I'm sensitive to the idea that we cannot actually talk about this for the next 4 hours straight. This is when I wish I ran the Lex Friedman podcast and we just booked all day, just like we'll just keep talking. I recently noticed that Lex started to introduce bathroom breaks into his podcast. And like, that's a good innovation. You should, in fact, allow people breaks. But this has been a tremendously interesting conversation and is, like you said, different than most of the ones that I think happen in the data community. But I, like you, have come into the conversation in the data community from the perspective of a practitioner. Like I you mentioned my marketing background. Before that, I was, whatever. I'm fundamentally interested in the idea of making data operationally useful. And the main vector of attack that I have had on that over the last 8 years is to bring the data engineers who understand the technology better and the data analysts who understand the business better closer together, like unify their tool sets, common culture, etc. But that is only as useful as the fundamental value proposition alive in their organizations of how do we actually create business value out of this stuff. And so the idea that all of our organizations could have a more effective mental model that drives more value from the data that they have and the tooling that they have is very, very interesting. I guess maybe this is kind of useless because, everybody at the end of their book has to write a chapter on I just spent 17 chapters describing the problem. Now here's my one chapter on if I could wave a magic wand, how would I fix it all? And then no one really ever believes them because, well, problems exist for a reason. But do you think that there's a vector on which SPC can regain mindshare that it maybe had in the 1940s, leading up to World War II?
I'm a lot more cynical than a lot of my new friends in the data world who have discovered this. They are hopeful. And so shout out to Ergus Jablati and Taylor Murphy, because they have been like, no, we can't change from within. So I will, inspired by them, I will say this. So from my perspective, I'm working from the business side of things. I believe that if you change the executives, or maybe not every executive, but some executives, and then some set of businesses, and then the data people who work for them will have great lives, right? And will have actual business value. And that's sort of what I'm working on. Plus the whole Xamarin thing, which I want to talk a little bit about at the end. Just please go steal the code. But Taylor and Ergus argue that given knowledge of SPC, it should be possible for an individual data person, individual data analyst, or engineer, or data team lead to go to some set of execs or some set of people that they have affinity for, that they're friendly with, and say, what are your business goals? And let's go figure this out, right, together. And you want them to come in as allies. And then you want to show them, hey, this is very simple. It's just you make a change. Here's the chart, right? I will administer the chart. And I'll tell you when it's the change you've made is successful. And let's just do this trial and error loop to try to deliver your KPIs and get you promoted and make you incredibly successful in the business. And then you start like that, and you build political power like that, right? Because you become a useful asset within the organization to help them achieve their goals, assuming that they actually try to achieve their goals, because not every business person, some business people are not interested in achieving the organization's goals, right? But assuming that they are, you can sort of present yourself like that. And I have a tiny story for you. I taught this, I've been teaching this to various people. One of them was a junior person working in a hospital group here in Singapore, and she applied process control to the very little that she had control of, which was one of the things that was, she's in a marketing function. One of the things that she had control over was Google Maps, right? So the Google Maps listing of all the clinics in this hospital group. So she subjected this to process control, and what did she find? She found that if you optimize the listings of all the Google Maps, put in good photos, put in good phones, try to get some reviews, you get exceptional variation in the very next month across incoming calls. And the problem, of course, was that incoming calls was dealt with a different department that she didn't have any power over. But she could go to her boss with this evidence and say, hey, can we do something about this? The other thing that was very interesting that she found was that, so Singapore has a downtown core, and then there's the suburbs, basically. It's not really suburbs, but for sakes and purposes. The clinics in the downtown core depend on who the doctor is, because they're often celebrity or famous doctors that people want to go. And when they are on leave and there's a replacement doctor, right, you see exceptional variation that's lousier. Whereas in the clinics, it didn't really matter. So that could inform HR, but again, she didn't have power over that, but she could give it to a boss, and the boss could then go to ops people and say, hey, this is an insight we can use, right? This is knowledge. This is something predictive that we can do when we are sort of scheduling doctors to move around. This is an example of somebody who didn't have a lot of political power, but she still made an impact, right? And it's a very sort of different feeling from your service desk data. And data is just this thing that they come in, ask questions, and sometimes they just throw away, even though you spend the last week going through hell and high water to get the answer. So I think it's possible. I believe in my data friends because I think they're more experienced than I am. Who am I to say what can or cannot be possible? I assume that you can build this, and it's very easy. It doesn't require statistical sophistication at all. we have the tool actually that if you are not a
share
BI
the
tool
URL.
vendor, xmrit.com, xmrit.com, Xamarin is how we pronounce it. There is a course that we sell for that tool. That's how we fund the continued development of this open source free tool. The course is the Metrics Masterclass. It teaches you everything you need to know and all the gotchas for this particular chart. And for this podcast, I've created a coupon code called DBT, right?
Let's see if we can create some exceptional variation.
Maybe we'll see. We'll be watching it every week, right? So DBT, the coupon code, you get 10% off. And if you are a BI2 vendor, please steal the code. Steal it's a very simple piece of software. The thing that's novel about it, it's just the UI improvements that we've made that we think should have been done a long time ago, but most people working on this were from manufacturing, so they don't know the right software. Go implement XML charts in your BI tools, please, and spread the word.
Hell yeah. Cedric, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Thank you. I had fun.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs. I'm your host, Tristan Handy. Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com with comments and guest suggestions. Our producers are Jeff Fox and Dan Poppy. If you enjoyed the show, drop us a review or share with a friend. Thanks for listening.